It was an ordinary day at a bustling zoo, where families and tourists roamed the grounds, eagerly snapping photos of animals from around the world. Among the crowd, one very familiar face was quietly observing, his towering presence barely noticed in the excitement of the moment. Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball player, had decided to take a break from his usual spotlight to explore the zoo and enjoy the sights. Little did anyone know, this seemingly average day would turn into something that would shake the foundation of the zoo itself. As Shaq meandered through the exhibits, he found himself drawn to the chimpanzee enclosure, a popular attraction known for its charismatic residents. But what he didn't expect to witness would soon leave him not only shocked but deeply disturbed. There, in front of a group of unsuspecting visitors, a zookeeper was doing something that could only be described as cruel. The zookeeper, in an attempt to entertain the crowd, was mistreating a baby chimpanzee. The poor creature, still fragile and innocent, was subjected to rough handling and harsh gestures, all for the sake of a few laughs and applause. The zookeeper, oblivious to the growing tension around him, continued with his cruel performance. But little did he know, someone in the crowd wasn't just another tourist. Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had spent years in the spotlight and witnessed countless situations of both admiration and scrutiny, could see right through the act. He wasn't about to stand by and let it happen without doing something. What followed was a chain of events that would not only expose the zookeeper's actions, but also reveal hidden layers of power and responsibility that no one could have anticipated. This wasn't just another case of animal cruelty. It was a collision of fame, justice, and the ethical treatment of creatures that have no voice of their own. As the story unfolds, we'll dive into what happened when a celebrity witnessed an innocent being in pain, and the lengths he went to in order to make sure that no one would ever forget the lesson that day. But what happens when the man who could have remained a bystander chooses to act? What ripple effects does one decision make on an entire institution? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of a much deeper and more unexpected journey. As the zookeeper continued to row-handle the baby chimpanzee, Shaquille O'Neal stood there for a moment, his towering frame stiffening with anger. The chimpanzee, a young animal not more than a few months old, was visibly distressed. It tried to escape, but the zookeeper held it by the arms, forcing it to perform tricks for the crowd. The crowd, amused by the spectacle, didn't seem to notice the cruelty beneath the surface. Laughter echoed around the exhibit, but for Shaq, it was anything but funny. He had seen his share of rough situations. As a basketball player, Shaq was no stranger to physicality and toughness. But there was something about seeing a helpless baby chimp treated like a prop that struck him on a deeper level. He had always been an advocate for fairness and respect, both on and off the court. Growing up, he had witnessed the struggles of the underdog and understood the importance of using your platform for good. This wasn't just about an animal. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. The zoo, known for its educational tours and family-friendly environment, had always prided itself on its commitment to animal care. But as Shaq looked around, he began to wonder how many other animals had suffered in silence behind the scenes. The zookeeper's behavior was just one example of a much larger problem, one that wasn't easily visible to the average tourist. This wasn't the first time Shaq had encountered animal mistreatment, but it was the first time it had happened so blatantly in front of him, in a place meant to protect and educate. As he approached the enclosure, Shaq felt the weight of the situation. He was no longer just a tourist on a casual outing. He was a witness to something much darker. The zookeeper noticed Shaq's approach, but instead of taking it as a cue to stop, he seemed to grow more animated, sensing a chance to show off in front of the famous athlete. But Shaq wasn't impressed. His mind raced, trying to decide how best to intervene. It was clear that the zookeeper wasn't going to listen to reason. He was far too caught up in the attention he was getting from the crowd, his ego inflating with every forced move the chimpanzee made. Shaq could feel the tension building in his chest. He could see the discomfort in the baby chimpanzee's eyes, hear its soft whimpers as it tried to break free. He was used to dealing with difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't a game, it wasn't a challenge he could outsmart. It was about the welfare of an innocent creature. And Shaq knew that if he didn't do something, no one else would. At that moment, something shifted within him. The peaceful nature of the zoo, the supposed sanctuary for animals, felt like a farce. It was a place that promised safety and care, but beneath the surface, there were signs of exploitation, greed, and disregard for the creatures it claimed to protect. Shaq had seen the signs before. He had heard rumors, stories of zoos prioritizing profit over the well-being of animals. But now in that moment, he was witnessing it firsthand. Shaquille's eyes narrowed. The zookeeper, still oblivious to the gravity of his actions, raised his hand to the chimpanzee again. That was it. Shaq took a few determined steps forward, his voice booming as he called out to the zookeeper. "Hey, stop it." The entire crowd turned in surprise as Shaq's commanding voice echoed through the area. The zookeeper froze, his hand still raised midair, caught between his pride and the unexpected confrontation. The tourists around them fell silent, sensing the shift in energy. For a brief moment, everything was still, except for the baby chimpanzee, whose frightened eyes locked onto Shaq's. The crowd could sense the tension in the air, the heat of the moment thickening with every passing second. Shaq stepped closer, his presence undeniable. The zookeeper, clearly caught off guard by the interruption, tried to recover, nervously laughing it off. "What's the problem? We're just putting on a show for the kids," he said, but his words were shaky, his attempt at humor falling flat. Shaq wasn't having it. "This isn't a show. This is an animal's life. You're hurting it. Do you even realize that?" His voice was calm, but filled with an authority that demanded respect. The zookeeper tried to shrug it off, but the damage had been done. The tourists who had been laughing only moments before began to murmur, some even stepping back in unease. The zookeeper's smile faltered, his bravado slipping as he realized he was no longer in control of the situation. But then, just as the zookeeper appeared to be crumbling, something unexpected happened. The manager of the zoo arrived on the scene, a tall, well-dressed man who had been alerted by the growing commotion. The moment the manager saw Shaq, his face went pale. He knew this could be a nightmare for the zoo. Shaquille O'Neal was not just a random tourist. He was an icon, and the media would devour this story if it got out. The zookeeper's actions could jeopardize the zoo's reputation, and the manager, realizing the gravity of the situation, quickly moved to intervene. "Shaq, let's talk about this," the manager said, forcing a smile that barely masked his panic. "I assure you, this is just a misunderstanding. We can discuss it privately." But Shaq wasn't buying it. He had already made up his mind. There was no more room for private discussions or cover-ups. He had seen enough. The truth had to come out, no matter the consequences. The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd waited for what would happen next. Would Shaq expose the truth about the zoo's mistreatment of its animals? Would the zookeeper face consequences for his actions? And most importantly, would the baby chimpanzee finally be given the safety it deserved? Stay tuned, because the battle for justice was just beginning, and it was about to take a turn no one saw coming. The manager's attempt at calming the situation only fueled the fire. Shaq wasn't interested in excuses or private talks. His eyes were fixed on the trembling baby chimpanzee, its big brown eyes now locked onto him as if seeking help. In that moment, Shaq made a decision that would change everything. He turned toward the manager, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't just about today. This is about every animal you've ever mistreated, every promise you've broken to the public. You have a responsibility, not just to make money off these creatures, but to treat them with respect." The crowd, sensing the change in energy, grew restless. Some were now questioning what they had just witnessed, their faces reflecting guilt for having been complicit in the zookeeper's actions, even if unintentionally. Shaq turned back to the zookeeper, who had taken a step back, nervously wiping his forehead. It was clear now that the zookeeper didn't know how to handle the situation. He had been operating under the assumption that no one would care, that no one would notice. But Shaquille O'Neal had noticed, and his presence was forcing everyone to confront the ugly truth. At that moment, the baby chimpanzee let out a soft cry, and the sound of its distress sent a shockwave through the crowd. It was no longer just about the zookeeper's behavior. It was about the well-being of a living, breathing animal that had been exploited for nothing more than entertainment. Shaq walked toward the enclosure, his movements deliberate and firm. He spoke to the crowd, but his words weren't just directed at them. They were a challenge to anyone who had ever turned a blind eye to the suffering of animals in captivity. "This is not how we treat living beings," Shaq said, his voice filled with conviction. "If you're going to keep these animals here for public viewing, you need to do better. This baby chimp deserves better. All of these animals deserve better." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Some of the tourists began whispering to one another, some nodding in agreement, others looking around, as if wondering how long this had been going on without their knowledge. The manager, still visibly shaken, realized that this was no longer just about protecting the zoo's image. The truth was out, and the world was watching. It would only take one viral video, one post, and the zoo's reputation would be in ruins. All right, the manager said, raising his hands in surrender. "We'll make sure to take better care of the animals. No more shows like this. We'll make changes, I promise." But Shaq wasn't done yet. He turned to face the manager with a hard stare. "You better. Because the world is watching, and I'm not the only one who cares about this." With those final words, Shaq signaled for the staff to release the baby chimpanzee from its restraints. The zookeeper, now realizing the gravity of the situation, stepped aside without a word. As the baby chimp was safely returned to its enclosure, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate, and the zoo staff quickly began taking steps to restore order. But the story didn't end there. Shaq's confrontation had sparked a larger conversation that rippled through social media and news outlets. People all over the world began questioning the practices of zoos, particularly those that exploited animals for entertainment. Shaquille O'Neal, known for his advocacy on various social causes, became an unlikely hero in the fight for animal rights, using his platform to raise awareness about the mistreatment of animals in captivity. The zoo, under immense pressure, was forced to reassess its policies. They began implementing stricter regulations for animal care, cutting back on exploitative shows, and focusing more on education and conservation efforts. The manager, who had initially tried to downplay the situation, now found himself in the spotlight, answering to the public for the zoo's actions. He promised transparency and pledged to improve the zoo's ethical standards. But for many, the damage had already been done, and the incident served as a reminder of how easy it is for those in power to exploit those who cannot speak for themselves. In the aftermath, Shaq didn't back down. He continued to speak out about the importance of treating animals with dignity, leveraging his influence to call for greater accountability in zoos and animal sanctuaries worldwide. He didn't seek fame or recognition for his actions. He did it because he knew it was the right thing to do. The baby chimpanzee, though forever impacted by the ordeal, was now in a safer environment, where it could live without the fear of being used for entertainment. And while it may have been a small victory in the grand scheme of things, it was a victory nonetheless. The incident served as a reminder that when people stand up for what's right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable the situation, real change can happen. The world may have watched as a celebrity took a stand for an animal, but the true message was clear. No living being should ever be treated as an object for amusement. Everyone, no matter their size or status, has a responsibility to protect the voiceless. It was a story that would live on, inspiring others to raise their voices when they see injustice, whether it's in a zoo, a circus, or any other place where creatures are exploited for the sake of entertainment. And for Shaquille O'Neal, this moment wasn't just about standing up for one chimpanzee. It was about setting a precedent, a challenge to everyone who witnessed the mistreatment of animals to speak out and demand better. The battle was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. And in the end, that was enough.